Hi everyone, this is Nicole Call and welcome to another Stukent expert session. Today we have the privilege of hearing from Michael Brito. He is going to talk about using data to make decisions around marketing, content reporting, and measurement. Michael is a digital strategist, published author, TEDx speaker, adjunct professor, and avid 49ers and Lakers fan with over 20 years of experience helping organizations break through the clutter and reach their audience with game-changing marketing programs. As an executive vice president at Zeno Group, he is responsible for helping clients reach their target audience with laser-focused precision, the right story at the right time, in the right channel, and with the right media. This unique methodology requires a combination of audience intelligence, creative editorial content, targeted paid media, and rigorous integration with traditional public relations programs. Previously, he was the head of social marketing at W2O Group and senior VP of social strategy at Edelman Digital, where he consulted for large brands implementing integrated content and digital marketing programs globally. He has worked for innovative Silicon Valley brands like Hewlett-Packard, Yahoo, and Intel, building online communities before social media was popular. Without further ado, here's Michael.
All right, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm really excited today to talk to you about data-driven storytelling, winning the war of brand relevance with audience intelligence. And data is very important to me, and that's coming from someone who failed algebra in college and high school, actually. But I've learned over the years to use data to really be smart about how to make decisions around marketing, content, reporting, and measurement. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about different ways to apply that in a business setting. My name is Michael Brito, and I am an EVP of Zeno Group. Zeno Group is an integrated communications agency. We're a global company with large Fortune 500 clients. Earlier in my career, I spent most of my time working in-house at technology companies like Intel, HP, and Yahoo. And most recently, about 10 years ago, I joined an agency, and I've kind of been on the agency side ever since. I spent 8 years in the Marine Corps. I did a TEDx talk probably 3 or 4 years ago in 2015, which was focused on building your brand, building your legacy, and that ultimately Google is the authority in your brand because we have a tendency of Googling pretty much everyone and every person we interact with or we interview or people that we just met. I'm an adjunct professor at San Jose State University. I've been doing that for 7 years. I also teach graduate students at Berkeley and also Golden Gate University around strategic communications, how to use data to make data-driven marketing decisions, content marketing, SEO, and everything in between. I've written 3 books on the subject, but enough about me. I want to talk really about the environment that we live in and how difficult it is to reach your customers with the right content at the right time and in the right channel. And what we're looking at here is what's called the 1-9-90 model. And I'm going to dig into this in the next few slides, but I wanted to highlight what this really means. When you think about a market, within that particular market, there's 1% of that market which are influencers. They are driving the conversation about a topic. The 9% of that market are what I call promoters or engagers or an audience. And what they do is they take influencer content, they repackage it, they provide context and share it. And then the 90%, which is the rest of the market, they are the ones who consume the content. They use Google and word of mouth to verify and validate their decisions, and they really decide ultimately what the 1 and 9%, whether or not they agree with what their perspectives are in terms of buying a product or downloading a white paper or investing somewhere. Today, we're going to talk about the 1 and 9% because that is where we have a lot of data to really understand unique characteristics, behaviors, media consumption, content analysis. But I wanted to just quickly say that when we're thinking about the 1% and the 9%, there's a lot of overlap. So keep that in mind, and I will talk through that and hit on that when we dig further down into the presentation. To go back to what I was referring to a minute ago, the 1%. Again, these are the trendsetters. When they speak, everybody listens. They've created new markets. They create buzzwords. They create new categories. Now, earlier in the kind of the internet days, most influencers were journalists. They were traditional media, traditional analysts. Today, it's a little bit different. Today, you have journalists in that 1%, but you also have bloggers. You have influential people on Instagram, Snapchat, and other platforms. So the 1% could be just about anyone who has an audience and a point of view. The 9%, again, these are the enthusiasts. They recommend products, restaurants, coffee shops. They're very similar to you and I, right? We use Yelp, we read Amazon reviews. They have a perspective. They aren't afraid to share their perspectives and their points of view about a brand or product publicly. They're downloading content. They're participating in forums and on Twitter. They're highly active online. And typically what they do is they take the 1% and their perspectives around a piece of content or a technology like digital transformation or the future of work, and they kind of provide their own perspective on it and then share it with everybody else. The 90% is everybody else. Now, typically, if you're Nike or you're Budweiser and you have $5 million to spend on a Super Bowl ad, you can reach the 90%. If you have large marketing and advertising budgets, you can buy out-of-home advertising on buses, on kiosks, on billboards, and you reach the broader market. Now, we know that that type of advertising is less credible and trustworthy than that of word of mouth and hearing it from other people. But this is how I would define the 1, 9, and 90. So let's talk about what an audience is. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to kind of think through this. And I try to segment this on the B2B side and the consumer side. So if you work at a technology company, this is going to resonate to you. If you work for a consumer packaged goods company or a company like Nike, or that's where you want to work, this will make better sense to you. But let me just highlight what this means. B2B audiences can really include anything. I talked about the 1%, right? The influencers around topics like security or artificial intelligence or big data or blockchain. We have IT decision makers. These are people within companies who are deciding whether or not to purchase technology or software. It could be the head of engineering. It could be a data scientist. You have your developer community, your full stack developers, your Java developers. You have the C-suite. These are the executives who are running the company, the CEO, CIO, the chief information security officer. You have your HR group, the head of HR, your chief human resource officer. An audience could be traditional journalists, or perhaps it's journalists who just write for Forbes, or journalists who just write for CNN. It could be the analyst community. However, whatever group you're trying to get, that would be considered an audience. On the consumer side, it's a little bit different, right? It's sneaker enthusiasts. If you work for Nike or you work for Reebok or Adidas, you really want to understand what sneaker enthusiasts are saying. If you work for Travelocity or an airline, you want to understand the travel aficionados. If you're trying to reach millennials and you want to understand their behaviors, that may be a particular audience for you. Foodies, gamers, even parent bloggers. So again, an audience really is however you define and that particular group of people is, and that's really how you're going to build your particular audience. And here's how you do that. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, and you can do combinations of all of these. So bio searches, a lot of times in your bios on Facebook, on Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, and Instagram, you typically write the things that you're interested about. Like you're interested in sports, or you like craft beer, or you're interested in, food or traveling or, technology. So simply doing bio searches helps understand and segment certain audiences. A lot of times you can use Twitter lists, because Twitter lists are almost like, if you're trying to reach a group of accountants and somebody in the internet created a list of accountants on Twitter, well, that could be your starting point for building an audience. It could be followers of a brand. If you want to reach people who read Forbes or who follow Nike or Red Bull or HP or Apple, you can build audiences based simply on followers of that brand in social media. You can use hashtags. So we've all used hashtags before. We see it on the trending topics all over the place. You can build audiences based on people who have used certain hashtags over the last 30, 60, 90 days. You can, if you have access to an email or a CRM system, you can do the same. You can build audiences based on email lists, or simply conversations. You can look at people talking about, a game like the NBA Finals or the NCAA Championship, or people who are talking about things that are happening in the world, like, news events and things that are trending globally or within your city. You can pull data to understand who is talking about that and then build an audience based on what those people are saying. So I want to just kind of pause for a moment and really talk about influencer marketing, because when I say the 1%, which I referred to earlier, those are the influencers. I just want to kind of reiterate and say there's a caveat, because everyone on the internet is influential, despite the people who are, the trolls and the internet trolls who are just creating accounts to make people upset. Everyone who has a perspective, everyone who has a small community, even if it's 10 people or 1 million people, everyone is influential. So that's why I wanted to kind of segment this slide to say, look, even if we're talking about the 9%, those are still influential people. And I want to talk quickly how you define influence. I'm going to start with the left here, relevance. So these are people who are talking about topics all the time, right? If they're talking about sneakers, or they're talking about Southwest Airlines, or they're talking about artificial intelligence, and they're doing so quite a bit, they're relevant, right? If it's somebody who mentioned it once a year ago, well, they're probably not going to be relevant for your business. Resonance is when they create content or tweet something or record a video or write an article. What's the resonance of their community? Does that piece of content drive a lot of engagement? Likes, comments, tweets. Reach is pretty self-explanatory. How big is their channel? Do they have, 1 million subscribers on RSS feeds? Do they have 1 million followers on Twitter? Do they have several thousand connections on LinkedIn? And then reference is within their peer group, are they being referenced by other influencers? When you take into consideration all of those 4 kind of inputs, that's really how you define that 1%. Now, when we think about understanding audiences, a lot of times it's just really understanding their characteristics, their keyword, the words that they're using, understanding where they live, where their focus channels are. And this is just an example of Kimberly Jacks, who's not a real influencer. She's a person I made up. And it just shows you how big her community is, right? She has 260,000 people that she could reach. You can see what topics are most important to her: artificial intelligence, innovation, technology, reading, social good. You can see how often she's using particular keywords. You can see the types of content that she's writing and publishing. Now, sometimes you may not need to engage with this audience. It's simply understanding what language, what vernacular, what topic she's talking about. And from a business standpoint and a content perspective, you can begin to create content that matches what these groups are saying, because that way you become more relevant if they come across you on social or they come across your content in a Google search. So simply understanding what they say is really going to drive dividends for your business. And here's an example of that. This is an example of looking at, on the B2B side, looking at a group of people, 15 to 20 influencers talking about security and artificial intelligence and digital transformation. And you can begin to plot out kind of the volume of conversation over the course of time. In this particular instance, we're looking at 12 months. And you can begin to see that topics like artificial intelligence, which is right at the bottom, is growing in terms of volume. So you know that this particular influencer group is talking quite a bit about AI, whereas topics like digital transformation is slowly declining. What's also interesting about this is you can begin to see what media that they're referencing. So for example, when they're talking about artificial intelligence, they're typically referencing or sharing articles from Wired and Forbes and Fortune. If it's security, they're talking about Dark Reading or The Verge. And this is extremely important, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But just understanding the trend of their conversation is not just great from a research perspective, but it can also inform your use of keywords, your use of hashtags, your use of content and stories that will be found relevant amongst a particular group. You can also understand what they're reading. So this is a little confusing, so let me just start at the top. That first logo there is TechCrunch. So what this data is saying, if you look at TechCrunch, is that 44% of your audience reads TechCrunch. So if you're a technology startup here in Silicon Valley, and you know that there's a high percentage of an audience reading TechCrunch, you may decide that you want to pitch TechCrunch or build a relationship with a journalist or sponsor content or buy ads on TechCrunch.com. The index number is interesting. That is what I would refer to as an affinity level. So what this is saying is that 44% of your audience reach TechCrunch, and they index 41 times more than the average person on the internet. What that's saying is the higher that index number, the more unique this audience is. So if we had, for example, the previous President Barack Obama on here, you would probably see 99% of an audience following him on Twitter and indexing at 1%. What that simply means is that your audience, everybody was following him online at one point, so that your specific audience is not that different from the average person using the internet. So the higher that index rate is, the more specialized and the more unique your audience is. So you can begin to prioritize, if you're in media relations or PR, you might prioritize gigaohm, for example, and I'm going to circle my mouse here, gigaohm, because while only 28% of your audience reads it, they index at 100 times, meaning they're 100 times more likely to read, share, comment on an article from gigaohm than the average person who comes across that article on the internet. So you may start prioritizing your media relations strategy purely based on this particular data. And that's really where it boils down to. So, as you think about, planning for 2018 and 2019, and if you really want to get into PR, you can't just pitch, the Wall Street Journal because, it's cool to be on the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or, USA Today. Maybe your audience isn't reading those publications. Maybe they're reading Motherboard, which is a Vice media platform. Maybe they're reading Wired or Harvard Business Review or InfoWorld. So if you understand, again, the priority of your audience and the affinities of your audience, you can start being smarter about your PR strategy. From a social media perspective, there could be a particular author that you want to get on their radar. This is an example of Tom Simon. Tom Simon is a reporter for Wired. He wrote this guide called the Wired Guide to Artificial Intelligence. Now you can see up on the top right, that's his actual article. And if I'm a company who is interested in AI and wants to get on his radar, or maybe he's not returning my phone calls or he's not responding to me, I may put a piece of creative content together that would get on his radar, that would link to his content, that would tag him on social. So what you have here is you have a company who's monitoring an influencer who is a traditional journalist who writes an article about the Wired Guide to Artificial Intelligence. So the company then, which says your brand here, puts together a piece of content, which is a tweet, with a creative piece of content, which is the image, and writes, is artificial intelligence helping or hurting the economy? At TSIOMNITE explains, link, and then there's the image. So you're giving this particular journalist credit, you're driving traffic to his article, you're putting some paid social, maybe $1,000 or $1,500 or more, to reach people, to reach an audience, to reach Tom in an effort to get on his radar. So this is actually quite common when you're a smaller company and you're trying to get on a particular influencer's radar. Plus, your audience is going to find content like this more relevant. They're going to engage with you. They're going to classify you as being an authority on the topic of AI, even though you didn't even write the article, right? You simply found the article that is written by a credible source. You package it up with your colors. You put your logo there and you share it. Now all of a sudden you begin to become the priority in those particular topics. You can do the same for executive communication. So a lot of times, CEOs and CIOs and people who are influential in a company want to become influential externally. So you can use the same data, the same content to then inform the types of stories you want to tell. So if you know that your audience is reading Wired and the Fast Company and Forbes and Ad Age, and they're using channels like LinkedIn and Facebook and Reddit and Medium, and the topics that are generating the most impact are topics like future of work, machine learning, robotic process automation, digital transformation, whatever keyword is important to your business, you could then begin to create content as an executive, very similar to the previous screen, but from a human, right, from the CEO of your company, and begin to engage with these particular influencers and also provide context and authority within those topics, and then start engaging directly with that particular audience group. In this case, it would be influencers. One of the things that is very important when you're thinking about kind of this this market of the 1990 and the fact that we live in a multi-screen economy, and most people have ADD or multitasking and doing 50 different things at once. You have to be relevant, which means you have to listen to conversations in real time, you have to engage in real time, and you have to create creative content in real time. And this is an example of how to do that. This is a very simple workflow where you're monitoring conversations, you're reporting on those conversations, you're activating content, which I've talked about a few slides ago, to engage with either that audience or with that topic. You're sharing that content, blog posts, GIFs, images, videos, things like that, and you're creating this kind of real-time piece of content to drive engagement, to drive reach, to really break through the clutter and reach your audiences with the right content and at the right time. So this is an important step in really bringing all of this data, bringing all this content and engagement together, is having the right infrastructure so that when you do have an opportunity to engage, you can do so in a very quick manner. In other cases, you're going to want to just collaborate with influencers. So in this case, you see an example of a white book, or excuse me, an ebook or white paper, rather. I'm making up words here. A white paper where you've asked a group of developers to provide context for key languages for 2018 or 2019 or 2020, whatever it is. You're giving them a perspective, and you're giving them the editorial kind of authority to write what's on their mind, what's on their perspective. And then you're using social on the right to drive people to that content. Now, you may tag the influencers, you may give them social content so that they can write about it on their social channels, but you're building an authoritative piece of content, not necessarily written by you, the brand or the company, but by a group of influencers. Now, all of a sudden, they're going to share it. They're going to reach larger communities, and their words and their perspectives and their points of view are a lot more credible and trustworthy to other people than you doing it alone. So now you're collaborating with influencers and you're engaging that way. Last slide here really is, thinking about all of these things, right? There's things that you can do to use just paid media to reach influencers. You can hire influencers if you're in the consumer space. You can hire influencers to really, talk about your company as long as they disclose the fact that they were paid. You can pitch journalists, you can pitch influencers. A lot of times you don't need budget to do that. You just need time and manpower, maybe an agency to help you do that. Shared media, which is that example of creating something social. Owned content, which is more kind of that ebook, white paper approach. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of think about influencer engagement. Here's a list of the different KPIs you might want to consider, and then also kind of a budget associated with that. And with that, I just want to say thank you for listening to this quick session. I hope it was beneficial to you. Here's my information in case you'd like to follow up with any questions. I've been doing this for many years, and I love to share with students and with other peers in the industry. So if you have any further information, here's my contact information, and I'd be more than happy to talk with you. Thank you very much.